Hello, good morning. I'm going to do, as those of you who've watched these before, I'm going to do what I have done previously and just wait for a couple of seconds for it to catch up and for people to join in. So I will carry on speaking in a second. Hi, welcome back to Learn With Lorna, and this one is the 14th in the series. It's so bizarre for those of us in the UK to know that this is the 14th that we've been in this setting and operating from my home into my spare bedroom rather than into my office. Um, so this one is the last one that I'll be doing that will have activities linked to it. This is because they were originally set up to link in with the school term. Obviously, that's ending this week in the Highlands, so um, the activities that go alongside these won't go on from next week, but I will be back next week doing another talk. I'm going to carry on doing them for the foreseeable future. um, so there will be others, but as I say, no more with activities for children. The first thing I wanted to say before I go on and talk about this week's subject was really just a massive thank you, because it's been so nice seeing all your comments, seeing where people are watching from. And we've had people from South Africa, Japan, Australia, Canada, America, all sorts of places, and obviously the Highlands and wider Scotland as well. So thank you for that, and thank you for sharing the talks. Thank you for commenting and giving us your feedback on them and taking part. And thank you also to those of you who have deposited things with us as a result of this. So we've had a few people contacting us saying, I've got things in my family collection, or I've got things in my office drawer, do you want them? And that's been really appreciated as well. So as I say, I will carry on doing these next week, but as we come to the end of this first run of them that were in this batch aimed at schools, I just wanted to say thank you so much for all your comments. It's a difficult time for heritage organisations at the moment, as it is for all sorts of businesses, and it's just really nice for us to know that we've been able to still engage with you and connect and have so many of you respond to us and to our collections. So thank you for that. This week we're looking at the clearances. If you want to tell us where you're from, I'm going to guess that a few people will be watching from the likes of Australia, America, places who have people who've maybe had family connections to the Highlands. So do tell us that if you're watching from one of those countries, and of course, always if you're watching from the Highlands, let us know as well. The clearances, very very simply, was the large scale emigration and eviction of people from Scotland to other areas of Scotland and also to overseas. Before I start on this, one thing I'm going to say is that this is a very emotive subject. It's a controversial subject. It's a painful subject for a lot of people. People feel very strongly about this. The clearances had huge long-term consequences, and they've shaped millions of lives here in the Highlands, in Scotland, and across the world. They've also shaped a lot about the way the Highlands looks, the way the Highlands systems work, the image of the Highlands that's portrayed across the world. It's also one of the main reasons that there are so many Highlanders, the diaspora, which is the people who have left the Highlands to go to other countries and other places, is so large. But before I say anything else, I'd like to say that this is a subject, like every other, that you can't generalise about. So I'm already talking about the Highland clearances. It's important to note that people were cleared and emigrated from across the whole of Scotland. So there were lowland clearances as well. But obviously in my job, in my remit, I'll be talking about how the Highlands have been impacted by this. If any of you were watching a couple of weeks ago when we did fake news, this is also a subject has been subject to fake news. It's had what's been reported about the clearances has depended on who said it, when they've said it, what the time frame has been that they've said it in. And so that's important to remember as well. A lot of what's been told is one-sided and a lot of it is romanticised. So that's another thing just to bear in mind. So the image that we have when we think of the Highland clearances of buildings being burnt down and people forced out their houses, all of that is true, and I'm in no way going to take away from that fact. But it's not the full picture. So I'll come on to that in a second. And as I've said on, I think, one previous week, I'm not a historian. I can certainly recommend, if people are interested, there are a lot of historians. Jim Hunter's written about it, Tom Devine has written about this, various others who will have done a huge amount of research. What I'm here to talk to you about is an overview of the subject and point you towards the documents in our collections that tell some of the story of the Highlands. So the context that the clearances happened in, there's always been emigration from Scotland, there's always been emigration from the Highlands. So there are Highland communities spread across the world from, certainly from the 1300s, and I'm sure from before that as well. But the subject that generally gets discussed as the clearances, that time frame tends to be about 1750, 1760 for 100 years, so till round about 1850 or 60. And that's the time frame we're going to talk about just now. The Highlands have always historically been slightly different from the rest of the country. As time progressed, the lowlands found themselves having more in common in some respects with England and with the South. They had a common language, they had more of a common culture, whereas in the Highlands there was obviously the predominance of Gaelic speaking and of a different clan system, which was less prominent in the South. So that's one thing to bear in mind, that the Highlands were a little bit different and seemed to be a little bit different. The other thing that's important to think about in the context of the clearances is that these were very hard economic times for most people, actually. Obviously, if you were a chief or a landlord, your idea of a hard economic time was different to the people down the scale, if you like. But comparatively speaking, people had less money than they had previously. I touched a little bit on the clan system that was in the Highlands. So this was the chief, the clan chief was at the top. He would then rent out land to tacksmen. So that's TACKS, tacksmen. So if you ever come across that in a document, this is what this means. It's a sort of intermediate level, usually related to the chief, but someone who would lease land, take land from the chief and rent it out to others. So he was the next level down, and then the clansman underneath that. So that's the structure that this happened in. In obviously the 1700s, we had the Jacobite uprisings culminating in the Battle of Culloden in 1746. After the Battle of Culloden, if you don't know a lot about this, go and watch Jacobite Week. I love Jacobites, the best subject. So after the Battle of Culloden, there were two acts passed that were particularly relevant to this. One was the Act of Prescription, which I talk about a lot in Jacobite Week, which is where there was huge limitations put on the wearing of tartan, speaking Gaelic, carrying weapons, that sort of thing, trying to break down the strength of the clan structure. And the other law which is relevant to this was the Heritable Jurisdictions Act, which is a lovely, easy mouthful. And that was a law that meant that the power of the clan chiefs was very much reduced. So what had been a natural relationship for hundreds of years of that clan chief and clansman, the power of that was taken away, and the aim of that was to break down the clan system and make people more loyal to the crown. So all of these things had been happening in the mid 1700s. You can overstate, and people have done in the past, overstate the extent to which the Jacobite rebellions had an impact on this, but it's again just worth bearing in mind for the context of how this happened. The clan system was breaking down, there wasn't a lot of money about, and as the landowners and the clan chiefs found themselves with less money, they then would sell estates or try and manage their estates differently in a way that would bring in money. So this resulted in a wave of new landowners coming from the south or from different areas, and also, just as I say, a change in the way those Highland landlords managed their estate. So the traditional relationship that had existed in the clan system was breaking down. Most of the clearances happened to do with reasons to do with economy. Mostly it was because landlords needed or wanted extra money for their estate. There were lots of different schemes that happened. There were lots of people who were farming cattle, different things to try and bring in money. But most famously, this was associated with sheep farming. Now, as I said at the beginning, I don't want to simplify this because I know there were clearances in the south, there were all sorts of different things, but from our point of view in the Highlands, I'm going to focus on the most common. And also bearing in mind that I started these to speak to school children, so I'll keep it to a simple level. So yeah, most famously, the clearances were connected with sheep farming. They happened right across the Highlands, but again, most famously, they tend to be associated with the county of Sutherland. It's estimated, or one estimate says that in the sort of 10 years between about 1810 and 1820, the number of sheep, this is an extraordinary statistic, the number of sheep in Sutherland rose by 750%. So this was because the landlords thought, we're not making any money from these tenants who are sitting in these areas of land. We're not making any money from them. So let's bring in sheep, make wool, make money. And so what many landlords did at this early stage of the clearances was resettle their populations on their estates. So quite often they would be pushed out of the central areas, which were seen as good grazing, good sheep rearing land, and put out onto the coasts. They would be put into little coastal villages. Some landlords created entirely new villages for them. So some landlords were very considerate, or not very considerate, but they tried to do something to mitigate the problem. They tried to give people a new living. Other landlords absolutely not bothered at all what the impact was on people. So they would be put out, they would have to fish, learn to fish. Some were involved in quarrying, but famously what a lot of people did was kelp farming, which was the gathering of seaweed on the shore, and then using that seaweed to create product. So you can imagine this is an entirely new world for people who have spent 400 or 500 years on the family little bit of land in the central area of Sutherland, say, and then they find themselves shipped out to a new coastal area. They've never had to fish, they've never had to gather kelp, they're not sure what they're doing. That's the practical side, but also the huge emotional wrench of leaving the place that you'd been connected to, your family had been connected to. So that was what started to happen in the first wave. There's lots of people famously connected with the clearances. Most famously, I would say, are, whatever you think of him, it's an interesting name. George Granville Levison Gower. So he was the Marquis of Stafford, the Count of Sutherland, soon to become the first Duke of Sutherland. His wife, the Marchioness, the Countess, had very strong opinions on this subject as well. And their factor, their estate manager, Patrick Seller, who is a very, very well-known name, both in the Highlands and further afield. So Levison Gower, he had been told by his advisors that his estate, which incidentally was about 1.5 million acres, it was the largest estate in Europe at the time, and he had been told by his advisors that he was going to make no money at all from keeping people on it, and he would be far better off to raise money by having sheep on the land. And so he started to move people, resettle them. But it's Patrick Seller's clearance of the land that is particularly famous and particularly brutal. So when I said at the beginning although the brutal burnings of houses is not the full picture, I'm certainly not going to take away from it because it did happen. So I'd like to tell you a little bit about Patrick Seller, but also read the most extraordinary quote for you. That's why I'm holding bits of paper here, because I want to get the exact quote right. I'll tell you first of all a little bit about Seller. So he, as I say, was particularly brutal. He was one of those people who, when he got rid of people from their houses, he would burn them, he would flatten them, he would have no real thought about the consequences to people's lives. There was one eyewitness who described what he did to these estates. He said, I stood on the hillside and I watched 250 houses in Strathnaver on fire. Strathnaver is again in Sutherland. And he said, I stood there and I watched hundreds of houses burning. So he did this not infrequently when he had to clear houses. On the 12th of June, 1814, he passed a message on. He couldn't speak Gaelic, so he couldn't tell the people themselves his message, so he had to get an intermediate person to pass on the message. And so he passed a message to someone called William Chisholm, again in Strathnaver. And he said, this was on a Sunday, and he said, you have until tomorrow morning to get out. I will be there by noon tomorrow, and if you're not out your house, I will burn it to the ground. And the people who were there at the times felt very uncomfortable with it. There's records of them saying that they didn't want to pass on the message. They thought it was very brutal. But anyway, the message was passed on. William Chisholm, we don't know if he just didn't take it seriously or if he was unable to do it or what the reason was, but he didn't clear out his house. And so the next morning, Patrick Seller arrived there and set fire to the house. Took out his possessions, threw them out of the house, and set fire to the building. Now, the reason that this was different from what he had done previously was that William Chisholm's mother-in-law, Margaret Mackay, who was believed to be over 90 years old and bedridden, was still in the house when it was set on fire. It's recorded that he tried to say that Patrick Seller said to the people, oh, there's someone screaming in there, go and get her out. But the people who were doing his bidding were so frightened that she would die on their hands that they didn't go. And in the end, it was her own daughter who went back in and pulled her mother out of the house, because she had started screaming as the flames approached. So her daughter pulled her out of the house and put her into a shed or a byre or a bothy or something out by the side of the house. And she lay there and she died 5 or 6 days later. This is a very famous story and a lot of this is on record, but the one thing I found particularly moving when I was reading about it again yesterday was they were offered 6 shillings compensation. Now that, I worked out, equates to about £14 in today's money. So it was the equivalent of 2 days' wages that they were offered. So for this act, Patrick Seller was taken to Dornoch Jail, and one of the documents we've got up on our website to show you is the Dornoch Jail book showing his entry of being taken in on a charge of willful fire raising and culpable homicide. So he'd set fire to the house and he had, because of his actions, somebody had died. He went into Dornoch Jail. He was very quickly bailed out for £100, I think. This was all in, as I said, June 1814. By April 1816, Patrick Seller had been honourably acquitted. So at his trial, he was found not guilty. The jury were only out for 15 minutes, having been fairly clearly indicated by the judge which way he expected them to vote. One quote which I'd like to read to you from Patrick Seller. He said, Lord and Lady Stafford, so they were going on to become the Duke and Duchess of Sutherland, were pleased humanely to order the new arrangement of this county. And he says about moving people to the coast, This was a most benevolent action to put these barbarous Highlanders into a position where they could better associate together, apply themselves to industry, educate their children, and advance in civilization. That's an interesting quote. He's sort of implying that this was the best opportunity. Now, a lot of people feel strongly about Patrick Sellars. A lot of people still, 200 years later, really have very strong feelings about what he did in the Highlands. But it's very interesting to note two things. One is that he was with a group of people who genuinely believed that Highlanders were a lesser class of people. Obviously, living here myself, I'm not vindicating that point of view, but it's just interesting to note that there were people who believed that. The other thing that's very interesting is that he himself was from a cleared family. So his grandfather had been cleared from an estate in Banffshire. His father had then gone on to become a lawyer. Patrick Sellars himself had become a lawyer. And so there maybe was an element of him going, well, if our family hadn't been cleared, we wouldn't have had these opportunities. It's interesting that coming from that background himself, he still had that opinion. So as I say, I'm not justifying his actions, but it's just something to bear in mind when you think about him. So as I say, on the website, there's the jail book there. Do have a look. It shows him being arrested for willful fire raising and culpable homicide. And it's just one of those documents. When you've grown up knowing the name Patrick Sellars all your life, it's an amazing document to hold and go, yeah, I have a connection to this and to this part of the story of the Highlands. So this was all in the sort of from the 1810s to 1820s kind of era. By the 1840s, we're coming into another wave of clearances. The Highlands were hit by a potato blight, the same that hit Ireland and other areas. The poverty was increasing again. We had massive famine in the Highlands. There were several years of crop failure and then riots following on from this. And then on top of all of that, the kelp industry, which was obviously the jobs that had been given to the people who'd been put in these coastal areas, the kelp industry collapsed. And so again, a huge crash in the economy and just not much money for anybody. And this is when we start to see more overseas emigration. So there were some before that. I've got another great quote to read you from 1775, which is written by John Aves. This is from a letter we hold at the archives, written to William Bailey, and it says, "The spirit of emigration to America still continues in the Highlands and is daily spreading and gaining strength. Many hundreds are going over this year from the Aird, from Urquhart, Glenmorrison, Glengarry, and other parts." So that's from 1775. So there were people already going overseas from the Highlands. But you start to see another wave of this in about the 1840s after this huge crash in food production and economy. So a lot of people going to North America, to Australia. So as I said at the beginning, if any of you have got connections to that area and that time, do let us know in the comments. It's interesting for us to see those. Tens of thousands of people left the Highlands at this time. Again, it can be easy to simplify. We tend to think that this was them being forced out by landlords, and again, it's not quite that simple. That did happen. A lot of people were given assisted passage, which meant that their landlord would cancel any debts that they had owed them and would instead pay their passage to the New World. That's one thing. Other people would apply through societies like the Highlands and Islands Emigration Society, and a lot of them actually had been able to put enough money by that they paid their own passage. So this is clearances through active clearing by landlords, but also clearances through people seeking a better life and a future for their family. So yeah, as I said, there were tens of thousands of people who left, and this is one of the reasons that there is such a strong connection to the Highlands from all over the world. Australia, Canada, New Zealand, America, all sorts of places have that emotional and practical connection to the Highlands. So there are lots of different aspects to this. One thing I'd like to just touch on before I finish is what the legacy has been of this. One thing is the legacy, the landscape of the Highlands. There's a huge legacy in that we are now underpopulated, and that we were very overpopulated at one point when people were in the way of the landlords trying to make money. But we're now a sparsely populated area of small communities. The physical landscape of the Highlands, there you can look all over and see the ruins of houses. Particularly in the areas I've been talking about in Strathneighbor and other places, you can see whole communities that are ruined houses. As I said, one legacy is the connection to the Highlands. Those people who left carried with them their culture, carried with them the musical traditions, language traditions. They spoke Gaelic, they played bagpipes, and that's the reason why we still see so many Highland games. In some ways, much more strongly connected with than they are here sometimes. So that's another thing. The third thing is again a physical legacy, which is statues. Now, this is a very current topic, a very certainly in the UK at the moment, a very emotive topic about statues. Who do we put statues up to, and what does that represent, and what does that tell us about how we want to be seen? So there is a famous statue of the Duke of Sutherland in Golspie. It has been a controversial statue since it went up. But as someone commented on our Twitter page yesterday, there is an argument that those statues serve as a reminder of what those people did, as long as they're, properly described and identified in that way. But also, there's a very beautiful statue in Helmsdale of a family. It's called Exiles, and it's of a family of people leaving the Highlands to go overseas, and it stands at the mouth of the Strath of Kildonan, which is an area where a lot of people were cleared from. And there's an identical statue that can be found in Winnipeg, in Manitoba, in Canada, and that shows the family arriving in a new world, in a new land. So we have these reminders all around us, and for those of us who grew up in Scotland or in the Highlands, it's something we learn at school. And as someone commented on a Twitter page yesterday, it depends who's teaching you and when you're being taught how much of a neutral story you get told. As I said at the beginning, it's a very emotional subject. It's something that people still feel very, very passionately about. Some people have described it as an ethnic cleansing, a genocide. Other people have said that's absolutely not what it was. That's some people have gone so far to say if you describe it as a genocide, that's actually an insult to those who have lived through a genocide. It's not like that. It's a different thing, but it certainly is a huge turning point in the history of the Highlands and the history of Scotland. And as I said at the beginning, it's shaped a lot of lives and a lot of landscapes. So if you want to go onto our website and have a wee look, there are, as I said before, there's the jail book that shows Patrick Seller being arrested. There are some articles about Skye evictions. Again, I've talked mostly about Sutherland, but there were some very famous evictions that took place in Skye and Rassay and different places. So there are some of that. There's a fantastic letter that describes the attempted clearance on the Coleraine estate in Rossshire. And it describes how somebody was trying to clear this estate. He took loads of troops with him, or he didn't the first time. He went with a couple of people, and all the women lined up and threw stones at them. There's windows of his horse and carriage got smashed, and then people came piling over the hill and threw things at him until he went away. And he came back with hundreds of soldiers, and in the end, they never were able to clear the estate. So that's a really interesting letter to read. The other thing I would really recommend that you do, if you're able to, is there's a link on our website to go on to Ambala and have a look. There are some amazing photographs of cleared sites, of the sites that people were put to on the coasts, and a film about Highlanders on the Move, which talks about the waves of emigration that have always happened from the Highlands, including the clearances. So I'm going to stop talking for now. Again, thank you so much for your time, for joining us. Thank you for commenting. It's really been appreciated, as I've been working from home and it's been very odd, and it's very nice to see your comments coming in saying that you're engaging with it and interested in the documents that we care for. We're so lucky in our work to look after tangible connections to people and places in the past. It's such a privilege. And so I'm really glad if we, by doing these, can make you feel that as well. If you're in the Highlands and you're at school, have a good, awesome school holiday. If you're a parent, good luck for another 25 weeks of your children being at home. And I hope you can join us next week. As I said, I'm going to look next week at a really important Highland business, which was the Rose Street Foundry, which went on to become AI Welders. So a lot of people in the Highlands will have a connection to that business. If you're not in the Highlands, please join us anyway. It's a fascinating story of how one business can have a global impact. So I hope you can join us then. And again, thank you for joining us.